Hey everybody, this is for class on April 6th through April 10th. Let's turn this week to the culture wars as an aspect of public policy. Culture wars being the sort of deep cultural divide that shapes so much of our politics, not just our conversations, but indeed a lot of policies themselves. We'll talk more about the Supreme Court's involvement. We'll talk about public opinion when it comes to culture wars. And we find at the heart of culture wars is basically the conflicting definitions of what America is and what it means to be an American. So I couldn't resist this cartoon. Civil War era, blue state, red state soldiers, each of them embodying the principles of the current culture war as we know it. Yeah, this week let's look at those issues that divide American culture and play into public policy in a lot of ways. And then on the next lecture, let's have a look at Robert George's article, The Clash of Orthodoxies, paired up alongside Barack Obama's chapter from Audacity of Hope and the struggling attempt to define America.
And we stand against putting our wives and daughters and sisters into combat units of the United States Army. And we stand, my friends, we also stand with President Bush in favor of the right of small towns and communities to control the raw sewage of pornography that so terribly pollutes our popular culture. We stand with President Bush in favor of federal judges who interpret the law as written and against would-be Supreme Court justices like Mario Cuomo, who think they have a mandate to rewrite the Constitution. Friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. But this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side.
So it was said by Pat Buchanan at the Republican National Convention in 1992. Buchanan is about as far to the right as you can possibly be, as you can probably tell. He was way more conservative even than the incumbent George H.W. Bush was at the time, who of course lost to Clinton that November. But still, his big claim to fame isn't anything he did in politics. He ran for president several times for the Republican ticket, never won. But yeah, his real legacy is that phrase, the culture war for the soul of America. That is his phrase, and that's what he'll probably most be remembered for. Soon after that speech, through the course of the 1990s, James Davidson Hunter, University of Virginia sociology professor, wrote this really stunning book. Even today, it's extremely relevant, fascinating to read. The Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America, where he looks at the whole question of all the issues surrounding the culture wars from the perspective of a sociologist. And he ties in a great deal of political psychology too. As far as I know, he's probably the first major scholar of his kind to approach the question of cultural dissent this way. And he does it with a great deal of compassion toward both sides and an understanding of the way people understand themselves in American society, the fact that they wouldn't be who they are if they didn't hold the political views they have and hold them so strongly. Where do the culture wars come from? It's a long history of American cultural dissent going way, way back. Let's at least look, though, at the way that the current framework of the culture wars appeared. And that's, of course, starting with the counterculture of the 1960s, the anti-war movement that grew into the hippie culture, and the whole scene of the 1960s that gave everyone the impression that American society was just coming unraveled. All institutions were in doubt, the drug culture, and then, of course, at the highest levels of government, you had the Vietnam, you had Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, and then, of course, the Vietnam War, and then Richard Nixon and Watergate. And so all these doubts that seem to just ripple through society about our institutions and our traditions and our practices. The 1970s comes along, and you see this shift of the culture war away from sort of a libertine way of life, an anti-war doubt about everything, to a great deal of certainty about equality and equal rights, starting with feminism, the second wave of feminism of that era, as long as gay rights of the 1970s. This too, though, seemed to challenge not only institutions but norms and mores and all of our deepest assumptions about who we were. By the late 1970s, though, in response to the counterculture, in response to the equal rights movement, you see the rise of conservatism, old-time conservatism of William F. Buckley, of Ronald Reagan, of Russell Kirk, and all these intellectuals and scholars and a handful of public figures, and ultimately Ronald Reagan in 1980, as he won that election, that really kind of challenged the whole system. That society was becoming unraveled, not so much because of the counterculture or the hippies or the equal rights movements or all that, but because of government. Government is the problem, Ronald Reagan famously insisted. You remember that line. Meanwhile, liberalism went through an interesting change through the late 80s and on through the 90s, about the time that Buchanan was giving that speech. The transition to lifestyle liberalism. Lifestyle liberalism in the sense that everybody is an individual, that you are the sum of your choices. That famous line from Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, where it said that the liberty is the right to define the meaning of your own existence. That really was kind of the touchstone of the current form of liberalism at the time. So we go from counterculture, doubts about institutions, to radical equality of groups, to radical autonomy of individuals. My body, my choice. Expressed in terms whether of sexuality or reproductive rights. Same principle. Well, in response to that, the old school right of Reaganite conservatism or Bill Buckley shifts dramatically, starting in the 1980s, and then it really built steam through the late 80s and early 90s. And that's, of course, the social conservatism, especially the religious brand of social conservatism. Jerry Falwell and the Christian Coalition, Ralph Reed, the Christian right, really kind of takes over conservatism as a very specific set of social agenda goals, very different from limited government, tax cuts, and all the older conservative arguments. Now it's about social conservatism, family and marriage, and of course the sanctity of life and of opposition to abortion rights and all these kinds of things. As time passes, though, we enter kind of the current phase that we're all familiar with, populism, that seems to have taken over the right for the most part. The populism used to be more of a leftist thing. Now it's on the right, especially Trumpish populism, very prominent among evangelicals, very prominent among vast swaths of red state America and other parts of the country too. And then on the other side, you get the rise of identity politics, focused primarily on race and intersectionality, that you are the sum of your identities, whether it be race and gender and sexuality, a variety of other things. And so this is kind of the shape of the current culture wars. What's really peculiar, though, about identity politics, there's Trumpish populism, but it's not just race and opposition to racism when it comes to ethnic and racial minorities. The same rhetoric of identity politics has appeared on the far, far right. The alt-right types with their protests. You remember the Charlottesville incident a few years ago, this horrific incident where all these white supremacists showed up in Charlottesville and with their tiki torches and then had their big demonstration the next day. It was a huge, horrible scene. But still, if you listen to what they actually said, and you can find alt-right writings all over the place online, they have the very same identity politics mantra as those on the progressive side. They describe themselves as victims, primarily because they're white men. So identity politics seems to be the most triumphant thing today. Individual narrative is the rule. Whole perception of justice is the justice that you perceive as an individual in your particular story. And so that seems to be the point that we're at. Where do we go from identity politics? You can only guess. It seems like once you're whittled everything down to the individual experience, that's kind of the end of the line. But to think more broadly about the culture wars and ideology, let's consider the way people label themselves very broadly here, and just looking at a huge swath of Americans. Between about 1992, that pivotal year when Buchanan gave that speech, when Bill Clinton was elected, and the dawn of the 90s as we think of it, most people identify either as conservative or moderate, which is really interesting. And they kind of intertwine, sometimes more conservative, sometimes more moderate, depends on what's going on. Far fewer people, though, at least for this period of time, identify as liberal or progressive. It does steadily climb from about 17 to 24 points over that period. And certainly, I think there are a lot more people today. This was up to 2014. Certainly, there are more people today who would identify as progressive, even more as socialist, and the appeal of Bernie Sanders and campus left kind of movements. But it is intriguing, though, that still a large number of Americans prefer either conservative or moderate. Who are those moderates? Are they people who are really progressives but just don't want to admit it? Possibly. Progressives don't tend to like to call themselves progressives. Something that Hillary Clinton pointed out to her fellow Democrats. We should re-embrace the title progressive. Never really caught on, though. Are they just people who are kind of a toss-up? Are they kind of the swing voter, the independent? People just don't really think about politics because it's nasty, dirty business, and so they like the term moderate because it means they're open-minded. That seems a little more likely. Where do we get the culture wars from at the deepest level? What shapes us to take one side or the other in big public questions of dissent? The number one factor, and political scientists find this over and over again, is family. Family is the main thing. You inherit your whole political education from your family. That might be because your family is overtly political and talks freely and openly about politics all the time. That was certainly my family. Or it might be because your family doesn't openly talk about politics, and yet they hold certain political assumptions that stick with you in subtle ways. In some ways, that's even more powerful over people's political views than overt political discussions. So questions of what justice is and equality is between siblings, questions of what authority is and parenting style and that kind of thing, that too seems to be a major factor. One thing that political scientists find a lot is the consistency between parents and kids in their political views. If you look at it just in terms of partisanship, those who plan to vote Republican say that they are about the same by 77% as their parents. Only 13% say they're more liberal, only 9% say they're more conservative. Contrast that with those who plan to vote Democrat. Still, 71%, very, very high. But notice the game that Democratic parents that are sort of run-of-the-mill liberals tend to have kids who turn out even more liberal than they are, as opposed to the 4% who go conservative. And then those who remain independent, still 61% are consistent with their parents. So yeah, there's a lot of continuity across generations here in the way that people think about politics. The other major factor, very closely aligned with family, is of course religion. If you consider the role of religion in shaping people's political views across religious groups, take Protestants, which would include evangelicals being the biggest group in the United States, just in terms of sheer numbers. 37% to 36 are moderate to conservative. They are much more inclined to say that they are conservative that way. Only 10% very conservative. This is in 2009, so it's a little bit dated. I couldn't find a newer one, but my guess is that if you took evangelicals as a sample, they'd be even more conservative today. Catholics, 40% prefer the moderate position, and that's very true to the way Catholics think about politics. It's the single biggest unified religious group in the United States. Evangelical Protestants aren't really unified. There are a bunch of different denominations and groups and congregations. The Catholics are one big church, and so you can get a clearer picture of their views because they're so unified theologically, even though politically they're kind of all over the place. 40% moderate, some 16% more liberal, 33% more conservative. Mormons, huge shift. They are very, very conservative. Even though they're small, they are growing fast because they have massive families. And so if you think like 50 years from now, Mormons are probably going to be much more significant. Jews are much smaller, but much more significant to certain parts of the country. New York State, West Hollywood in California, certain pockets of Jewish neighborhoods are more important. They tend to be they tend toward the moderate position to more liberal position. Muslims really like being moderate, which is very interesting. And it does make sense for them pragmatically. They're socially conservative on certain issues, marriage, life, but they are much more progressive on foreign policy and the role of government and society. The number one thing, though, when it comes to religion that determines political views is the attendance gap. Political scientists find this over and over again. This is also an old graph, but you'd find about the same thing today. Weekly attendance is a huge factor when it comes to certain issues. Let's take abortion. Among Christians who attend church weekly, 39 to 9% say that they are pro-life, because, or maybe along with the fact that they attend weekly services. Look at how dramatically it drops when it's less than weekly. Attend once a month, seldom or never, it shifts the other way. So attendance seems to be a huge factor. Of course, the great mystery here is, does going to church more make you more conservative? Or are you already conservative and that makes you go to church more? That's a big mysterious question. I'll leave it for another class. What about women and their perception of politics and their role in politics? There is indeed a gender gap, as it is frequently called, though it's not that great through a lot of American history. It's only recently where we've seen women have significantly more liberal views than men. And that's mostly because women get married later, a lot of political scientists think. They spend more time in school. That tends to have more of a progressive effect on them over time. If you look at it across time, though, like a lot of people, women start off more progressive, but gradually become a little more conservative across 10, 15 years, plus changes in family, marriage, and children, and that kind of thing. If you start off young and liberal, can you stay liberal across your life? There's the great challenge. Maybe the current brand of progressivism as we see it today will last longer than it did in previous generations. Here's a great graph, the satisfaction with the treatment of women in society between just 2001 and 2018. Look at how dramatically it drops off. Men, of course, have on average higher opinions of the position of women in society. Oh, they're doing fine, men tend to tell themselves. But they do listen, and they do get married to women, and they have sisters and mothers. And so over time, they learn to see that indeed women are struggling. Women themselves, though, say have a much lower opinion of society in the way that it treats them. You certainly see since 2016 in the Me Too movement, the realization that despite all the gains of past feminism and 1960s feminism and women's liberation, still the struggle is really bad, and the way that men treat women is quite terrible. So the struggle appears to continue. Take specifically the issue of sexual assault. How concerned are you about being a victim? Men, not concerned at all. Right? It's very, very low, though it does happen, but still, a lot of men just don't think about it. Whereas women, way more concerned. It's like your radar is always on when you walk through a dark parking lot. You're always a little bit aware. Of course, the thing that really brought attention, like we said, was the Me Too movement to this question of sexual assault, not just harassment, but assault and mistreatment. The other major question, though, that's older is reproductive rights. How does that play into the way women look at things? Do you think that abortion should be legal in all circumstances? Let's take Americans in general. Legal under certain circumstances, that's what most Americans seem to think. Yes, they want abortion rights protected, but they want to be moderate about it. How exactly, the graph doesn't quite explain, but still, they seem to see, most Americans seem to see some role for this. But take women in particular, those who identify as pro-life and pro-choice. For a long time, the pro-choice numbers were higher, but not that much higher than women who called themselves pro-life. And indeed, around about 2013, you saw around about 2016, I should say, 17, you saw the pro-life side surpass. So it's about a 50-50 for women when it comes to positions on abortion. Some are very pro-choice, some are very pro-life since 1995. What about race and ideology? We'll talk more about civil rights as it relates to education policy here in a few weeks. But yeah, white people, the largest group, though that's going to change dramatically in the coming decades, as we know. But yeah, white people in general, they are more of a toss-up overall when it comes to how they vote, whether Democrat, Republican, or independent. Black voters are really Democratic, as they have been since the 1960s, since the Civil Rights era. Even though they have doubts about the Democratic Party, even though there's a lot of dissent within the Democratic Party among black voters, they still consistently vote Democratic. The Republicans have struggled to make gains among black voters, and they have for just a tiny margin, but on the whole, it's very, very high in favor of the Democrats. Hispanics tend to vote much more Democratic to independent. Voter turnout in the past has been significantly lower for Hispanic voters. It's only been since about the 2000s and the Bush years that we saw this real explosion in voter turnout among them. But yeah, they tend to prefer the Democrats, but the Republicans have made some inroads, and it seems like they might have a chance to do that again or at least it did until Donald Trump came along and just kind of dropped the Hispanic vote in the Republican base. We'll see, though, what happens with future Republicans, if they'll get realistic about the size and significance about Hispanic voters, and the fact that in 2012, they were kind of the deciding vote between Romney and Obama. They were the swing vote in Colorado and Nevada. And of course, what about geography? We talk about red states and blue states. You can look at it more carefully in terms of red counties and blue counties. And as a general rule, the more rural parts of the country, across the South, across the Midwest, up into the mountain states, those are red, red, red. But remember, they tend to be more sparsely populated. It's the coastal regions, it's the Rust Belt, at least until the 2016 election. That changed dramatically. It's New England. And then you notice a curious line going across the South. What is that? The blue line. That's where the railroads went back in the old days, where cities tended to pop up, and indeed, urban dwellers tend to be a lot more progressive. So, geography has a big impact, too, on the culture wars. And of course, age. The older people get, the more conservative they become. The younger people are, the more progressive they are. So it's a very unusual thing to see old man Bernie Sanders making such inroads with young voters across the land. Not enough to win the nomination, or we'll see what happens. I doubt it. But still, age tends to turn people more and more conservative. Why is that? Is it just life experience, or they pay more taxes, or who knows? There's a lot of factors that go into this, but it seems if the data is right, unless something dramatically changes, we're all destined to be conservatives in our old age. So there's the great challenge. If you're progressive, can you stay that way into your 80s? See what happens. Of course, the big one is sexuality, which is unusual if you consider, because sexuality and gender identity constitute a very small number of people overall. At the highest levels, it's like 4.6%, according to Gallup. Other polls seem to show this. I mean, that's a liberal estimate of how many LGBT people you're talking about. You find them predominantly on the western United States and little patches of New England and Florida, and of course Hawaii. But then from those states, it drops down significantly. But still, 4.6%. I mean, even if you just round it up to 5, that's a very, very small number of people across the United States who identify as LGBT. So why is it such an important thing in American politics, you wonder? It's not enough people to swing an election. They're broadly distributed across the population, so you don't really get like neighborhoods so much, except for maybe the Castro district in San Francisco or Greenwich Village. But even those are very small overall compared to like the broader voting base in those parts of the country. So what's the deal? Well, the deciding thing seems to be, and why sexuality and gender identity is such a big issue, it's not so much LGBT people themselves as it is, do you know someone who is LGBT? That seems to be the deal breaker. Progressives who are more open to LGBT rights and same-sex marriage and all that kind of thing, they tend to be more likely to know someone who is gay or lesbian or transgender. Whereas moderates and conservatives, it ticks down a few points. So that seems to be it. A lot of what we're talking about with LGBT politics and public policy, we'll discuss same-sex marriage this week, has much more to do with knowing someone who is gay or lesbian or transgender than being that yourself. Still, though, what have we seen with public opinion? All that knowing people. We have seen a dramatic change when it comes to same-sex relationships. Leaving aside marriage, just relationships. Since about 2003. 2003 was like the pivotal year for same-sex marriage, and we'll talk about that in a minute, where people really started to change their minds, and it's been ticking upward ever since. Of course, those who haven't changed their minds, those who still oppose it, that just makes them even more consolidated and certain of their position. But overall, yeah, the attitude is shifting. When you take same-sex marriage as an issue, we'll turn back to that later, there was also a dramatic shift in favor of same-sex marriage through the course of the Obama years. So overall, if you take the array of sensitive cultural issues and the issues that are wound up in the culture wars, obviously reproductive rights and sexuality are at the top. You could also add attitudes toward alcohol. Of course, we're not going to see any temperance laws again, I don't think, but attitudes toward divorce and no-fault divorce and the laws in states that outline divorce litigation. Gambling, I guess, still bothers some people. Smoking marijuana is part of it, on down the list. Yeah, you see sort of an even distribution of where we disagree. It's a really intriguing graph, the 21 major issues. So let's look through each of these issues in turn. What about abortion? Let's consider the way that this is actually a public policy issue. It's mostly an issue, as we know, for the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's important to remember the court has left some room for states to do public policy as it relates to abortion. They technically cannot take the right itself away, but they can place certain regulations on it, and the court has given them permission to do that, and the court continues, of course, to review those laws. We'll look at that in a second. But yeah, what's the pivotal argument coming from the U.S. Supreme Court, 1973? I'm sure you've heard it, Roe versus Wade. It comes from the right to privacy, according to Harry Blackman. Where does the right to privacy come from? It's not stated in the Constitution. It's not stated in the Bill of Rights. Well, no, it comes from some earlier cases that point out that, sure, the Bill of Rights doesn't specify privacy, but if you consider no unreasonable searches and seizures, if you consider no quartering troops in your home, or in the Third Amendment, if you consider just the whole scope of the Bill of Rights, keep and bear arms, religious freedom, all that, doesn't it sort of add up to privacy? Isn't privacy kind of the overarching goal? Okay, if that's the case, doesn't privacy also include reproductive decisions? The right to privacy, Blackman said, whether it be founded on the 14th Amendment's conception of personal liberty, or restrictions upon state action, as we feel it is, or in the 9th Amendment's reservation of the right of the people. He adds that too. The right of the people, it is broad enough, or sorry, the reserved rights for the people. It is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. However, a state may properly assert important interests in safeguarding health, maintaining medical standards, and in protecting potential life. Does the state still have an interest in protecting both women's health and prenatal life? Yes. Blackman says this, though, to point out, look, it states, if you are interested in protecting women's health, what do? You keep abortion legal. Otherwise, you drive women into the proverbial back alley abortion situation, turning to crank doctors and putting themselves at great risk to their own health. But as far as protecting potential life, yeah, the state does have an interest. And the general ruling was, in Roe v. Wade, what? Up to the first trimester. That's it. At some point in pregnancy, these respective interests become sufficiently compelling to sustain regulation of the factors that govern the abortion decision. Okay, so there's your window of policymaking, states. If you want to pass laws relating to abortion, you have to do them pursuant to women's health, and you only have within the first trimester. So there it stands in 1973. Remember, though, there was more to Roe versus Wade than that. There was also the doctor's exception. If the doctor deems it necessary to terminate a pregnancy after the first trimester, okay, that too is constitutionally protected. When Blackman said that, he didn't anticipate that the doctor's exception could go pretty late across that 9-month, 3-trimester pregnancy. Still, at the time, he thought, we're diffusing the issue here. We're getting rid of the problems. The Supreme Court is saying, all right, states, you have a right to regulate abortion, and individual women and physicians, you have the privacy to terminate it. There, fair is fair. And so Blackman really thought he struck a balance between the two opposing sides. Well, what happened? The doctor's exception by 1992 turned out to be later, and because of prenatal technology or postnatal technology, it turned out that the fetus could survive earlier and earlier. Viability turned out to be quite a bit earlier than people thought. So there's a contradiction in the rules here. What happened in Planned Parenthood v. Casey? The court, instead of waiting for that constitutional crisis to appear, they said, all right, we're going to side with the doctor's exception. The state has a legitimate interest in seeing to it that abortion, like any medical procedure, is performed under circumstances that ensure maximum safety for the patient. Okay, fine. But a statute which, while furthering a valid state interest, has the effect of placing a substantial obstacle in the path of the woman's choice cannot be considered as permissible. So here we get, you all know it, the undue burden test, given to us by Sandra Day O'Connor, who co-wrote the opinion with Anthony Kennedy. The undue burden test. Okay, states can regulate abortion, but they must not cause an undue burden, she argued. So, what's the current argument when it comes to these policy debates over abortion rights? It has flared up in certain states. Probably where the biggest incidence was in Texas. One of you is writing a paper on this. When the Texas State Assembly tried to place certain regulations on abortion clinics, they looked really clear to a lot of people like it was an attempt to cause that undue burden. Of course, it was appealed to the Supreme Court and struck down. But still, let's just consider like the normative questions of the abortion debate. What are they? As Conrad points out, much of the debate has to do with just terms. What, what is pro-life? What is pro-choice? But also, what is the unborn exactly? Is it a person or is it not? If not, okay, when does something become a person? Or conversely, what early stages in fetal development must it be to still be considered a person? Back and forth they go. Public opinion on the issue has changed in some interesting ways. We mentioned women's views of abortions, but what about overall view of abortion rights and those who call themselves pro-choice or pro-life? They have evened out considerably since the mid-1990s, and it is about 50-50 across public opinion. The pro-life movement it was thought when Roe versus Wade came down. Of course, in 1973, it was kind of a back burner issue. No one was really thinking about it. Back then, it was all about Vietnam and Watergate. But it was after Roe versus Wade was handed down that you saw an actual pro-life movement take shape with the March for Life and just get bigger and bigger. Now it's just huge and it just never seems to go away. Whereas the pro-choice side is more the establishment. And so, but yeah, public opinion seems to be more of a toss-up, and there is an enduring pro-life position that really insists that abortion has to end, that there is no such right. How will they ever succeed without this overturning the Supreme Court? It doesn't seem possible. But yeah, that aside, what are the arguments? If you are pro-life, let's take that side first and look at the other side. Normally I would do this on the board, but I can't see you all. If you are pro-life, though, what are the arguments? Probably the most overarching one is that there is one of the most basic rights, and this is probably the oldest anti-abortion argument, the right to life. Right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. That life sort of precedes all other rights. If there is not a right to life, then there are no other rights. But the more common argument you hear is, of course, deeply religious. It is rooted in the Bible for evangelical Christians. It's rooted in church teaching for Roman Catholics. And other religious groups look to their sacred writings and their teachings. There is what they perceive to be a very clear religious mandate. Although the important thing to keep in mind when you think about religion in the culture wars is that religious people aren't always necessarily making religious arguments. That seems hard to believe because they say religious things. They talk about God, they quote their Bible, that sort of thing. But a lot of times they are actually making statements about the common good. They're just framing it in religious terms. And so it's a good exercise to try to separate out what are they actually saying about the common good? What are they saying about a more philosophic understanding of human life, regardless of the religious terms that they use? Because if it is all religious, then can't we just invoke the First Amendment, non-establishment, tell them to butt out of politics and argument closed, keep your beliefs to yourself, that kind of thing. But I think it's important to remember there is actually a public argument here, and you may disagree, and it may be a wrong argument, but it isn't always just religious. But still, what are the other philosophic arguments? Leaving aside the basic human right, leaving aside the religious argument, others on the pro-life side will say that there is a sort of slippery slope that has to do with sanctioning abortion. It leads to a disregard for human life in other ways, that it sort of harms social morals and an understanding of what a person is. If the unborn is not a person, it kind of raises the question, well, who is a person? Of course, once you get to the questions of late-term procedures, it becomes very apparent if an early-term procedure and the fetus is obviously not viable, it can't survive outside the womb, that's one thing. But what if it is viable? What if it can? Isn't that basically legal infanticide, says the pro-life side? Isn't it state-sanctioned murder, they argue? So what does the other side, though, say? What are its basic arguments? Pro-choice side insists that, look, legally speaking, the fetus is not technically a life. Just look at the wording of the Fourth Amendment. What does it say? Or 14th Amendment. What does it say? All persons born or naturalized shall be citizens of the United States. Born, right? Not conceived, but born. Birth is the marker of when you actually become human and citizen. Now, of course, the pro-choice side says, look, pro-lifers, if you believe that the fetus is a person, fine, go ahead and believe that, but believe it for yourself. Don't try to enshrine it in public law and force everybody else to believe it. They insist. But really, I think the stronger argument and the more common argument that you hear for the pro-choice side is just the personhood of the woman is superior. Harry Blackman points out in Roe versus Wade that a lot of the anti-abortion laws that started to appear on the books in the late 19th century also appeared about the same time that women were gaining stronger political force, whether the right to vote or organizing interest groups. Now, that's kind of a conspiracy theory, but isn't it curious, he says, that men were basically invoking the fetus at a time when they were going to use it against the woman. And so that tends to be a very strong, enduring pro-choice argument. The more pragmatic argument, though, has more to do with the women's health. As we pointed out a minute ago, look, if states want to protect women's health, they will keep abortion legal. They will comply, obviously, with the Supreme Court, but also just use their own judgment. Keep abortion legal so that women don't go to dangerous places to get the procedure. So there you have it. And there's the debate, and there's a lot to say about it. I will open it up on the forum this week, like I did last week. Be interested to hear your views on what you think the strongest arguments are. This is an old culture war. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a foundational culture war issue. It's been simmering, you might say, since Roe versus Wade, and it has only gotten bigger and bigger ever since. It really does, though, go to the fundamental question of what personhood is. If a person is something that is self-evident at the point of conception, as the pro-life side says, then that means that abortion is completely unacceptable, at least in civil law. Maybe there are exceptions, but the exceptions should not become the rule, they would say. Although if a person is instead only those who are born, then personhood is a construction of the law. Personhood is something that society agrees about what a person is. It's not self-evident. It's something that we sort of make up through our cultural institutions. And once we decide what a person is, then we give them all the rights and protections we possibly can. So there's the fundamental debate, and it's appropriate, I think, to consider this first when we talk about the culture wars. What about, though, when we talk about life issues more broadly, the right to die? This really came to the nation's attention in a dramatic way, you probably remember, with the Terri Schiavo case. Terri Schiavo was in a coma in 2005, severe brain damage because of, if I remember right, it was a severe eating disorder she had, and then several complications that came from that. So yeah, horrible, horrible case. And she'd been in this almost vegetative state for a few years, persistent vegetative state. She couldn't breathe without being aided by a respirator. So the question becomes, is it the right of the family to pull the tube to let her finally die, or what? Legally, her husband, she was married, her husband was her surrogate. He was the one to make the decision. Her parents, though, were very devout Catholics and very socially conservative on this issue. And so for a while they agreed, but then her husband met another woman, wanted to get married, but legally could not do that so long as her wife was still alive. We said, well, she's in a persistent vegetative state, but the law was like, well, no, we can't allow it. And so suddenly he changed his tune. He said, I want to move on. I want closure. We need to pull the life support. And this huge legal battle erupted. It was in Florida between the husband and the parents, going back and forth, and hordes of protesters showed up, and this big national discussion. Is this right to die something that someone else can decide for you? Now, a lot of people anticipate this, especially if they have terminal diseases, if they're in old age, they take out they plan for power of attorney, it's called, where indeed, if I'm on a respirator after a certain period of time, go ahead and shut it off and let me die. And so they'll make sure that the paperwork is in place to let that happen. But Terri Schiavo, she was young, she didn't do this. So what to do? And it just erupted in this huge national discussion. People claimed, including Bill Frist, Tennessee Republican heart surgeon, that he met Terry and said he's talked to her. She's fine. She has brain functions. Other doctors, though, took CAT scans and said that measurable brain waves were just gone. And so the Schindlers claimed that they had 6 hours of video evidence of Terry talking and pleading for her life, uh, which was never actually submitted to the public. So what to do about this? Well, finally, the government got involved. Governor Jeb Bush persuaded the state legislature to pass Terry's law to protect her and protect people like her in the state of Florida, and mandated that the tubes be surgically reinserted and that she be kept alive. And the battle went on and on and on. Finally, a lower federal court struck down Terry's law. The tubes were removed and she passed away. Still, sensitive questions about life issues. And you can see this is kind of the other end of the abortion debate. Just as where does life begin is a bit of a mystery. Is it best left to individual choice, especially of the woman? So too, when does life end? Whose choice is that? And what if the person in question can't make the choice because they are unconscious? Along the same lines, though, what if you are conscious and you are dying from a terrible disease and you want the help of a physician to take your own life? The major question of physician-assisted suicide. It's kind of quieted down in recent years, but for a long time it was a huge issue, especially because of Dr. Jack Kevorkian. Dr. Kevorkian was well known for traveling the country and helping people take their own lives, to do it peacefully and quietly. And he would make sure that they were sedated and put under, and then they would, or not sedated, but given painkillers anyway, and they would be handed a switch that they could then choose to press by their own free will to start the process of dripping the stuff that would finally take their own lives. He was arrested in Michigan and actually spent several years in prison. And a lot of people came out in his support, saying that he really was this deeply humanitarian figure. And so this started the whole right to die movement. Organizations like Death with Dignity, the Hemlock Society, arguing that they had this right to a physician to take their own lives peacefully and quietly instead of some horrific and violent way. That it was up to them. They had to choose if their life was going to end at some point, if they were terminally ill already and they were just facing, months or maybe years of horrible pain. They had the right to avoid that. When? It was up to them. How? It was up to them, at least with the assistance of the doctor. So yeah, for a long time, the only state that allowed this was Oregon. But then, more recently, a few other states joined in. Vermont, Washington State, California, and Colorado also passed legislation, not so much protecting the right to die as protecting the physicians who would assist people in taking their own lives. So yeah, very tricky question. The debate has quieted down in recent years, but on one side, obviously, you get people who say, look, it's my body, it's my choice, just as we argue with abortion, so too with the right to take my own life, and there's something dignified and honorable in that. Ancient philosophers like Stoics would have agreed. It's been around for centuries. What's the big deal? Other people point out, though, probably one of the most prominent is Wesley Smith, the journalist. He points out, look, there is actually some pressure put on people to take their own lives. It's not just an individual choice when your family is kind of subtly expecting you to do it to ease off the medical bills and the burden on the family and that kind of thing, or society perhaps. Other people are doing it, maybe you should too. It's not just an individual choice. And so the real challenge with physician-assisted suicide is the question of whether or not there really is an individual choice here being made, or really, does personal autonomy actually rule? Does it really go that far? Or is there really kind of a social decision over the right to die that still matters? Like I said, it's quieted down in recent years. We will see, though, if there's another Terri Schiavo incident, if this rises to the same level of national concern. Or, of course, another physician prosecuted in one of those states that doesn't allow the right to die. It did go to the U.S. Supreme Court a couple of times, and every time they deferred back to the states to exercise their own judgment. It was the lawsuit was actually based on the Controlled Substances Act, which is mostly about illegal narcotics and the war on drugs and all that. but it was also applied during the Bush years to apply to the drugs used in physician-assisted suicides. So we'll see if there's another Dr. Kevorkian, if there's another similar situation. This could come to the surface again in public policy. Then you get embryonic stem cell research. This is the perfect case study when it comes to public policy because it has come and gone. No one's really talking about it anymore. But if you went back to between about 2000 and 2004, in the Bush years, this was a hot domestic topic. What is embryonic stem cell research? Well, first of all, what is a stem cell? It's a kind of cell that can be, if doctors figure out how, it can be manipulated to become any other kind of cell. So it's like a generic cell. It multiplies like any other cell does, like skin cells or tissue cells or whatever. But it can multiply and produce more of these generic cells. And that means if doctors learn how to manipulate them just right, you can reconstruct tissue. If you can reconstruct tissue, you can grow new organs. People with kidney failure, people with spinal cord injuries, maybe even neurological diseases, maybe even diseases like Parkinson's. But still, it's kind of inconclusive. There's a possibility that this might happen, but a lot of doctors who do embryonic stem cell research say it's a long ways off. We need the funding. We need several years to try to figure out what we can actually do with stem cells. So yeah, it could be a miracle cure if it actually goes forward. It has in recent years. The tricky thing is, though, where do you get stem cells? Two sources, either adults or human embryos. Embryos, especially at an early stage, have a lot of stem cells in them because they're yet to become any number of tissues as the embryo grows. Adult stem cells can come from cadavers or organ donors, people who, so you can get adult stem cells, but the tricky thing with them is on their own, they don't replicate themselves very far before they start becoming a certain kind of tissue or another. You need to be able to replicate them many, many, many times to make them become the kind of tissue you need. Embryonic stem cells, though, replicate much, much further. And so if doctors said if we could get a hold of embryonic stem cells, if we could produce them in a lab in particular, then we would be able to carry them on and come up with the kind of tissue construction that we're trying to get. Well, you see the tricky problem here. Where are you going to get the embryos to get the embryonic stem cells? Huge investments behind this. All the money and the bond measures. The state that led the way was, of course, California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and Proposition 71 a few years ago put forward all this state money to fund embryonic stem cell research in the state to try to find cures for diseases. A lot of that money, though, went to the embryonic stem cells. So you see the financial interests here, and you see the stockholders in some of the pharmaceutical companies and the biotech companies. On one hand, they're not interested in all of the deep ethical questions about when life begins, but the public was, or at least the very pro-life side of the public. What's the tricky thing about getting the embryonic stem cells? They're not extracted from embryos naturally conceived in the case of like early abortions. They are extracted from embryos created in a lab, like test tube babies, like you'd find in a fertility clinic, but then they are destroyed. So in other words, you're not just destroying human life, you are creating human life specifically to destroy it. And so the debate erupted during the 2000s and the Bush years. Is this ethical to create human life? What else might you be creating human life for? There was that science fiction film that came out, The Island, about a bunch of cloned people living in some location, promised that they're going to be sent off to a tropical island. Turns out they're all clones of people living in the real world, and they'll be harvested for organs. So dystopian horror stories that came out of this debate were all over the place. Still, I mean, the promise of embryonic stem cells for people who were supportive of this research, especially people who had spinal cord injuries, who were suffering from Parkinson's. The actor Michael J. Fox, Ron Reagan, speaking on behalf of his dad, former President Ronald Reagan. It was a really hot issue. 2004, though, it kind of hit its peak fervor in the election. George W. Bush being the incumbent and John Kerry the challenger. Of course, the major issues in those days were in that time was the war in Iraq. But the major domestic issue was precisely this question. Is the federal government going to consider embryonic stem cell research funding through the National Institutes of Health? In other words, will researchers be allowed to write and receive federal grants for really, really high powered grants for millions of dollars to do this, the way California had? Well, how did that debate go? The Democrats, John Kerry, said absolutely. He was highly supportive of this research. How could the American people deny such a promising form of medical technology? George W. Bush said no way. And Bush famously summoned the President's Council on Bioethics. You might notice if you go in the office in the political science building, our very own Robert Krynek actually served on that council and contributed to the report. You can find his chapter in the book. But yeah, what happened here? Bush took a hard line against federal funding for embryonic stem cell research. Now, this is creation of life to destroy it. But after the election, Bush thought about this more seriously and said, all right, here's a compromise. What was it? He said, all right, the federal government, I will authorize the federal government to, or Congress anyway, to fund NIH grants. In other words, I won't veto the legislation again, which is what he did earlier. I'll allow them to do this just so long as the embryos we are talking about are taken from fertility clinics, in which case they are going to be destroyed anyway. So an infertile couple trying to have a baby usually doesn't just have like one embryo. The procedure involves like hundreds. Why exactly? Well, because not all of them survive, so they want to pick the ones that do. That's also the inspiration for the film Gattaca, you might have seen with Ethan Hawke and Jude Law, where people pre-select their embryos. So yeah, a lot of sci-fi films reflecting on this question at the time. But yeah, Bush said, all right, I will approve any federal legislation that appropriates funds for stem cell research that has to do with embryos taken from fertility clinics. There's the compromise, because they're going to be destroyed anyway. And most of them don't, they're not going to be implanted and become people's children anyway, so those will be fine. So there's the compromise. What happened, though, with embryonic stem cell? Why isn't it still an issue today? Well, it fizzled because some Japanese scientists discovered a way to make non-embryonic stem cells reproduce themselves indefinitely. So as a result, we got stem cell lines that would replicate themselves even better than embryonic stem cells did. Had Bush not taken this move, we probably never would have discovered, or the scientists anyway, wouldn't have discovered a way to do that. There wouldn't have been an incentive for it. There wouldn't be investment in it. Now that they've discovered it, United States biotechnology firms and even those kinds of organizations now can apply the same method and come up with very long stem cell lines that can be dedicated to research and curing the diseases, even better than the embryonic stem cells would have. So this was a very good stroke for Bush. Say what you will about Iraq, say what you will about No Child Left Behind and all of his terrible policies. He really did buy some time that, as a result, came up with a good compromise. On one hand, we're not creating life to destroy it. On the other hand, we got stem cells that can actually work. So there's a great story when it comes to public policy. It comes and goes. What about, though, the highly sensitive issue of same-sex marriage? It's important to remember that this emerged in American discourse kind of in response in a lot of ways to the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. AIDS spread among gay men predominantly as a sexually transmitted disease, though it was also spread with needles and in some cases with straight sexual contact. But still, San Francisco really had this major outbreak of autoimmune deficiency syndrome that killed off men's immune systems. And so the response was initially, once it was clear that this was sexually transmitted, social conservatives looked at it and said, what? Well, hey, it's sexually transmitted. It's behavior. It's the choice you made. It's the risk you took, right? But a lot of progressives, though, looked at it differently, that we needed a public investment in this. And so they accused all of these prominent conservatives, Jesse Helms, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and apparently Hitler for some reason, I don't know why, but accused them of not taking enough interest in funding AIDS research. Reagan just completely brushed it off. He wasn't going to allow Congress to appropriate any such thing. Bush, though, actively said no, he would refuse. So the AIDS quilt, you've probably seen it before in Washington, D.C., remembering all the people who died from this terrible disease. What happens with same-sex marriage? Nobody was talking about this much. It was here and there. Shelby Spong, the progressive Episcopal bishop, had that essay about it, but for the most part, it just wasn't talked about at all. The first major argument came, though, from Jonathan Rauch, really interesting guy at the Brookings Institution, political science researcher, written a lot of really good books. He wrote that great one in The Atlantic a couple years ago, how American politics went insane. A brilliant writer. I really enjoy his work a lot. He, though, wrote the first book about same-sex marriage, or as he called it, gay marriage. He included lesbians too, but gay marriage. Look at the subtitle. Why it's good for gays, good for straights, and good for America. This book was just kind of a bombshell, even among social progressives, even among a lot of LGBT activists. It was just so far out there. We're trying to get just basic equality and overcome discrimination. You're talking marriage? His argument, though, was intriguing. He looked back on the AIDS epidemic, and, being openly gay himself, he said, look, if you say that gay men are promiscuous, you're right. But that's why we need marriage. Hey, weren't straight people wildly promiscuous back in, say, the old world in the early 19th century? Open marriages were actually quite common in Europe. Mistresses on the side and young lovers for married couples just didn't take their fidelity all that seriously back in Europe, but in America they did. He points out Alexis de Tocqueville's observation. If you read Democracy in America, where Tocqueville talks about marriage, he says Americans take marital fidelity so seriously. Yeah, people still cheat, but there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. Isn't that what gays and lesbians actually need too, said Rauch. This book is almost completely forgotten today. The movement really picked up steam through the 2000s and the Bush years, and then it just kind of exploded during the Obama years. What is the debate? Of course, the debate, legally speaking, is settled. We had the Obergefell decision in 2015. We'll get to that in a second. But considering the debate as it existed, and as it still exists in some pockets of America, why are some for it and why are some against it? How do we define marriage in these two opposing views? The opponents, no surprise, very much like the abortion debate, are very religious. Although religion has a lot more to say about marriage than it actually does about abortion. And so there's a lot more in the Bible, in the Old Testament, New Testament, and the Quran that actually say something about marriage. Are they interpreting it correctly? Well, that's debatable. I'll leave that for Bible scholars. But there is more of a clear pronouncement about marriage coming from religion. But again, you have to keep in mind, like we said a minute ago, just because religious people make certain arguments, they're not always make arguments that sound like religion. It's not always a religious argument. It is always, very often, an argument about the common good as they perceive it, sort of framed in religious terms. The supporters of same-sex marriage, on the other hand, tend to be a lot of them are religious, but they tend to belong to the more progressive religious groups like the Episcopalians, certain segments of progressive evangelicals, smaller groups like liberal Judaism. The Republican Party, though, has been sort of evenly divided on this question. Dick Cheney has been an interesting case. We kind of forget that Cheney, for all of his hawkish conservatism and foreign policy and tax cuts and Reaganite republicanism and all that kind of thing, Cheney's daughter is a lesbian, and Cheney himself has actually been very supportive of same-sex marriage. And so, yeah, Republicans are about 50-50. Those who support it try to downplay it and treat it like a back burner issue. Meanwhile, a lot of the social conservatives and the more religious ones still say it's a very big deal. Democrats, though, were slow in coming around. People forget Hillary Clinton didn't change her mind about same-sex marriage until, if I remember right, it was around 2013, I think. Obama took some time. I think it was just before the 2012 election. So they changed their minds over time. Let's look at the pro side first, though. The pro same-sex marriage side. Who argues for a right to marry whoever you choose, including someone of the same sex? Those who look at it as a matter of social equality, that equality is the fundamental rule here, that equality not just of persons in a civil rights sense, but of relationships. And they look at a straight couple, a man and a woman, they look at a gay couple, two men or two women, and they say, what is the fundamental difference here? Isn't love just love? Isn't love just people who are committed to each other in a profound kind of way and they want just one other person? What's the difference? And indeed, a lot of people who support same-sex marriage who are not gay or lesbian look at it kind of the same way, and they say, what's the harm to my marriage? A man married to a woman says to himself, what's the harm done to my marriage if two guys or two girls get married? Where's the harm? If there's no tangible harm to me in my relationship with my spouse, then why deny it to them? So um, there's that side, the social equality argument, but then there's the other side too. Not the other side, but the similar side that says, never mind the social equality, it's about the freedom of people to marry who they choose. No surprise, the two of the biggest interest groups arguing for same-sex marriage during these years, one was called Marriage Equality USA, and one was called Freedom to Marry. So there's equality and there's freedom. Two different principles, but they seem to lead in the very same direction, that you have a right to marry whoever you choose. Freedom to marry is more of a libertarian argument, more of a kind of who cares argument, how does it harm me kind of argument. There are sort of the fringe groups. There are the thruples, the groups of group marriage types out there, but they're not as prominent when it comes to the pro same-sex marriage side. But what's the con side, the opposing side, we should say? There are those who invoke a very religious, very socially conservative notion of traditional marriage, which by definition has to be one man and one woman, and nothing else. It can only be that. And so they emphasize a great deal of tradition, not just in terms of sex differences, but in terms of what the home needs. The fact that all kids need a mom and a dad was the popular, or deserves a mom and a dad was the popular phrase back in that era. Of course, when it comes to children, the pro same-sex marriage side says, well, sure, kids deserve two parents, but still, is having two moms or two dads really that much worse than living in foster care, which is where a lot of the children of same-sex couples are adopted anyway? Is foster care better? Some states it's okay, some states it's pretty horrific. Isn't it at least the lesser of two evils? You get two loving parents. Who cares if they're the same sex, right? Still, back to the opposing side, the opponents of same-sex marriage. There was a major law in 1996 in response to the early civil unions, as they were called, the first one in Hawaii. Bill Clinton signed it into law, the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. Clinton later said he regretted it. He wished he hadn't. But still, the Defense of Marriage Act, although it's interesting the way DOMA was worded, it says very specifically that marriage shall be defined as one man and one woman. Set it up in such a way that if you argued against it, were you arguing for multiple spouses? And so that's kind of the overarching kind of consequential argument you hear from the opponents of same-sex marriage, that if two men and two women get married, it will necessarily lead to a situation where you have group marriages, polyamorous marriages, 5 people, not polygamy in the Mormon sense, but polyamory in the sense of a dozen people all claiming to be married to each other. What does that do to society? What does that do to the stability of ordinary marriage? And so that tends to be one of their arguments. And it might sound kind of exaggerated and slippery slope, but then again, think about a marriage license, the way the state recognizes a union called marriage. Husband is to wife as wife is to husband. It's the only institution that has that kind of thing to it. Okay, if you're going to be inclusive, you have to say what? How about spouse A and spouse B? Or maybe spouse 1 and spouse 2, whatever you like. Is A exclusive to B as B is exclusive to A? No, why not C, D, and E? They argue. So that's a pretty compelling point. The other argument, of course, is procreation, the fact that marriage is meant to procreate children. But of course, a lot of those on the other side would say, well, what about infertile couples? You're going to bar them from getting married? What's the difference between them and two people of the same sex? Well, as we know, the question was pretty firmly settled in 2015, but it's interesting to consider the situation with same-sex marriage in the years just leading up to it. Several states put it to ballot measures to the people in the state. Will we choose to recognize same-sex marriage within our state? Some did it through legislation. Some did it through popular vote. Massachusetts did it with a judicial ruling, as did some other states. Others, though, passed laws through the states or through popular referendums saying that not only would they not recognize same sex marriage, but they would never recognize same sex marriage. In some cases, they were amendments to state constitutions. California did this a few years before with Proposition 8, as the state amendment to the Constitution saying that the state would never recognize same sex marriage. And of course, that went through the federal courts, it was struck down. But yeah, finally it happened, though. You'll remember in 2015 what happened here with Obergefell v. Hodges. The Supreme Court ruled that indeed there is a right to same-sex marriage. This was preceded, though, by changing public opinion and public attitudes, especially among younger Americans. Millennials have much higher opinion of same-sex marriage and growing than older Americans. But even older Americans have made steady gains of approval. And it goes back to what we said before. So much of LGBT politics, or same-sex marriage in particular, has to do with knowing somebody. And so it would happen that people who oppose same-sex marriage would then meet a same-sex couple who, as far as they could tell, were faithful to each other, who had a home, had children, and they said, oh, wow, they're married just like we are, just as I understand marriage. And so that changing of the mind was really prominent. You saw this in some religious circles too. David Gushee wrote his book, the title says it all, Changing Our Minds. He's a very popular Christian theologian. And so, yeah, you saw a lot of religious groups also kind of change their minds dramatically about same-sex marriage. So all this is what was leading up to Obergefell v. Hodges, the summer of 2015. Anthony Kennedy wrote the opinion. He had written several opinions in gay rights cases earlier. But what did he say? No union, he says, is more profound than marriage. Right? So there I agree with you, social conservatives. It's an important institution. It's a critical institution because it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people, whatever their sex is, right, two people become something greater than they once were. As some of the petitions of these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. He's referring, of course, to the two older men. One of them was dying, and they weren't allowed to be married in their state. And right after this case came down, they wrote the petition to the court arguing their right to be married to each other before one of them died. And so the case came down, and they were married very quickly before the one spouse passed away. Moving story. But Kennedy says it would misunderstand these men and women to say that they disrespect the idea of marriage. Right. So look, social conservatives, I see your concern about marriage. I agree, Kennedy says, but you're misunderstanding them. They honor marriage because they're choosing it. They want it. Their plea is that they do not respect. Their plea is that they do respect it. Respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to lives of loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. You got a lot of heat for that line. How exactly are they lonely? They can still be with each other even if they're not married, but whatever. They ask for equal dignity, though, in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right, and so it's official. The Equal Protection Clause, as well as the Due Process Clause. Kennedy actually looked at both civil rights and civil liberties, both the freedom to marry and the equality of marriage justifies federal recognition of same-sex marriage under the Constitution. Barack Obama, you might recall, 2012, claimed that not that he changed his mind about same-sex marriage, but that his views evolved. Which is a way of saying that you weren't wrong before, I guess. Way of avoiding having to apologize. Who knows? Andrew Sullivan wrote this article in Newsweek with a hilarious cover. The first gay president. Of course, he's not gay, but he was being sarcastic. But in response to Obergefell, the Obama administration lit up the White House in rainbow flag colors. So what did this mean for social conservatives? What did this mean for the remnants of the Christian right? This, for them, was total defeat. So even though Kennedy and a lot of advocates of same-sex marriage, even Jonathan Rauch, tried to say, hey, look, no, we're going along with your conservatism. We don't want sexual freedom anymore. The AIDS epidemic taught us that lesson. No, we want fidelity, just like you, social conservatives. And a lot of advocates of same-sex marriage just couldn't understand why social conservatives took this so hard. Marriage is marriage, right? But that's not how they saw it. It was total defeat. It was retreat from society. It was giving up. This was the turn to the Benedict option, as Rod Dreher puts it. It's a lot of religious people saying, all right, we're on the defensive now. it was easy to believe that if you consider the situation with all the litigation in the states. We mentioned some of these before. Here's we talked about civil liberties. Here's the other side. Jack Phillips with his cake shop, the sweet cakes incident in Oregon, and a variety of other incidents around the country leading up to Obergefell, where people with private businesses refused to serve same-sex couples and cater same-sex weddings on religious grounds. Right after Obergefell came down, of course, you had Kim Davis in Kentucky. There she is with Mike Huckabee, who was a county clerk who refused to issue same-sex marriage licenses to same-sex couples, claiming her religious conscience. She's in a different situation because she's not running a business. She took an oath of office. She's a public official, and she spent a couple of nights in jail in violation of her oath. Right away, she came out of jail with this huge hubbub. Oh, this is the victimhood that we're all looking forward to because of same-sex marriage. It's been remarkable, though, since Obergefell, her incident was really the only incident. Jack Phillips had his day in court, but remember, it all happened before Obergefell. Since Obergefell, it's been pretty quiet. Everything seems to have quieted down. That's partly because social conservatives have pretty much given up. At the same time, it seems once the U.S. Supreme Court rules in your favor for gays and lesbians and their allies who want them to marry, it hasn't really been much of a fight to be had anymore. In fact, a lot of businesses actively cater to same-sex couples. So has the issue gone away? Was Obergefell sort of like the ultimate victory, and now it's just there's nothing else to talk about? Will public opinion on same-sex marriage continue to rise to the point where nobody really cares anymore? That's certainly what a lot of its advocates believe is going to happen. But then again, you've seen the Nashville statement. You've seen a lot of evangelical organizations and socially conservative organizations hunker down and go on the defensive when it comes to civil liberties. So we shall see what happens with this in coming years. Next time, let's take a step back and look at the two supplementary readings. Like I said, Robert George's article from First Things magazine called The Clash of Orthodoxies came out several years ago, and he grew it into a book where he kind of lays out a more philosophic take on what a conservative is and what a liberal is and what the clash in society actually is. And then let's look at Barack Obama and his chapter from Audacity of Hope, where he talks about overcoming the culture wars. So while someone like Robert George and a lot of others sort of accept the clash as inevitable and that one side just has to win, it's very much like Abraham Lincoln. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and George would agree with that. Obama tries to say, no, it can. It's not a sort of winner-take-all kind of thing. It's not a clash that's inevitable. There's a third way. There's an evolutionary way out of social conflict, that the culture wars can be resolved in ways that make everybody happy. And that really was kind of the heart of Obama's political philosophy. You saw it in his public policy as well when we talked about healthcare. So yeah, next time we'll talk about that. See you then.